So I would like to introduce Matthew Storey, who is an archives historian at the State Archives of Florida. He assists patrons with research requests covering a wide range of topics, including general Florida history, genealogy, land records, and legislative history on a daily basis. He also conducts frequent tours and presentations on resources at the State Archives and methods for researching in Florida's historical collections. Matthew has extensive research experience in the 20th century Florida history and holds an MA in history with a concentration in public history from Florida State University. And our method is going to be to put all of your questions into the chat box. And after the presentation, we will be sharing those questions, and I will share your questions with Matthew. So thank you again. I will send it over to the expert.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. My name once again is Matthew Storey, and I'm just so thrilled to be here joining you virtually today. Our topic today, of course, is Florida on the home front. This is generally World War II records that you can find at the State Archives of Florida. Especially, we're going to be talking about Florida's civil defense system, because that was active in every town and every county. And in fact, we are as well going to look at a few things specifically that I found. What did things look like in Gulf County where those systems are concerned? Because that's what they are. We're going to talk about how does Florida on the home front look from the perspective of the state government, because that is what we have here at the State Archives of Florida. It may not come as too much of a surprise. We are the primary repository for the records of state government. Now, just a brief overview and some numbers before we dive into our topic today. The records I'm going to be talking about and we're going to be looking at are part of our collections, which total over 50,000 cubic feet of records. Now, that is quite a lot. To give you a rough idea, 1 cubic foot holds about 2,500 pages of records. And so if we do the math, that adds up really, really fast. 50,000 cubic feet, if we could stack them one on top of each other, would be about 10 miles. A big part of what we do, as well as Florida, is the Florida Memory Program. I hope you'll be familiar with it by now. If you're not, you're going to learn today. A lot of the images and documents we're going to be viewing are available on Florida Memory. A lot of my work is selecting what's going to be included on Florida Memory and making sure that those records are even more accessible than they already are. That being said, we do have to be pretty selective with 50,000 cubic feet. The truth is, I could not even see all of it in my lifetime, let alone digitize it and catalog it. All told, Florida Memory represents about 1% of our total holdings. Now, that's still, well over 500,000 items. But, this is the kind of number we're talking about. So for the rest of the things in the collection, things you can't find on Florida Memory, you're, of course, welcome to contact me or to contact, we actually have a full-time reference staff whose job it is to help people connect with the records in our collections, right? We want people to use these records. In fact, by law, the State Archives are open to any person. That's all it says, any person. So if you were a person, please do get in touch with us. If there's something you're looking to access, if there's research we can help with, just remember that's what we're here to help you with. So we'll see contact information towards the end of the presentation for all that stuff. Of all of those numbers I just shared, big numbers, we've got hundreds of millions of pages. Everything is organized by creator and by activity. We do have a fairly robust selection of records from Florida's state defense councils. This is in the World War II era, and later that morphs into the Office of Civil Defense by the Cold War. There's a name change, but this is kind of the beginning stages of not only that civil defense system, but these are the very roots of general disaster preparedness in the state of Florida. And so as we talk about World War II specifically, we can start to see some of the same programs that still exist, right? This is really a time in World War II that required an unprecedented level of cooperation and coordination by huge numbers of people, and that's across all levels of government, right? So every Floridian played a part in the World War II victory, and that included a lot of focus and a lot of coordination. So we can start to see Florida's place, and indeed the place of every county and every household, in what's kind of a chain that stretches from the federal level on down to individual households. And just to kind of contextualize the records we'll be talking about today, this is the state levels, how those big federal initiatives start to translate down to local efforts. Some contributions, of course, like rations for household goods and gasoline, we're all probably pretty familiar with. That's probably what you were thinking about when you see the title here on the Homefront in Florida. Those were legally enforceable and mandatory. There are other activities, though, that we can see in the records, like hunting for scrap metal or serving as an air raid warden. These were voluntary. Now, even these small actions, the state government helped to bridge that gap, as I say, between the local and the federal organizations. And that's what we have here at the state archives. That's the perspective we're looking at things from today. And it is interesting, in the role as coordinator, the records of the state government do let us see down to a level of detail that is somewhat uncommon in state level government records. These records do get pretty localized, and we'll even see in the case of Gulf County, probably some names you may know. So let's move right into this. Before we go any further, here is my contact information. You'll see it again at the end, but if you do have any questions for me, after today, if something comes to you later, don't hesitate, send me an email. We're going to talk generally, some of the things we're going to cover. We're going to cover rations, bonds, and salvage initiatives. Then we're going to move on to how the State Defense Council worked as an organization. How were these initiatives accomplished? And then we're going to talk about some of the volunteer programs that go into greater depth and really are maybe a more direct means of volunteer service than your rationing and your salvage drives and things like that. So we're going to move right into rationing. This is, as I say, probably what we all think about when we think about World War II and the home front. These are pretty well-known parts of life during that time. And odds are, we probably all know somebody who remembers those restrictions. And for a lot of people, this is the most direct way available to them to contribute to the war effort. Now, at the federal level, I'm going to be saying federal a lot today. This is all a very interconnected story. There is a federal Office of Price Administration, and they're responsible for managing the national supply of items which are critical to the war effort. This is going to be things like meat and gasoline and rubber. And so at the very top of all of this, they're in charge of the rationing initiatives. These ration projects served multiple purposes, primarily, of course, the needs of a militarized economy necessarily mean that production resources are going to be allocated differently. And that means that there's going to be less resources to go around. And this is just at the level of soldiers have to eat, and food sent overseas to them means less in stores back home. Other things are a lot less, immediate trades. For example, every airplane produced in Detroit represented a large amount of resources which were not otherwise turned into cars. There's a popular number you always see cited. There were plants up north that were turning out a bomber every 24 hours. That was their pace. That is a whole lot of planes. And again, that is a whole lot of planes which were not cars instead, right? This is kind of the trade-off we're talking about. As the Office of Price Administration's name would suggest, another function of rationing was to help stabilize prices. Having to provide ration documentation with a purchase helped ensure that people could not just buy out the local supply of something, which is to say, even if you had the money, stores around the state were responsible for making sure that they had the proper rations, as seen here in the State Defense Council poster. If you look on the slide over here on the right-hand side, you couldn't just walk in and say, I would like all of your chickens for the week. You have to present that ration ticket. That way everybody gets a chance at the more limited supply than normal. Especially price gouging and black market sales were prohibited. They carried really stiff penalties for both buyers and sellers. You can actually see some examples of ration books as well on the slide. This is all, again, drawn from Florida memory, so you can go through and look at these on your own a little later. There's URLs by way of citation down at the bottom, and especially this one at the top, punishments ranging as high as 10 years imprisonment, a $10,000 fine, or both may be imposed under the United States statutes for violation of the rationing orders. So really, like I say, that's a stiff penalty. Okay, 10 years. That's a long time. So this is something that the Office of Price Administration and the federal government are taking very seriously. And indeed, this is something that it's set at the federal level, right? And this needs to filter down to every household in America needs to get these ration books. By law, they have to have these to purchase those goods. We also see, a fuel ration. So again, this is not something where it's okay if not everybody gets a fuel ration card. No, you can't buy gasoline without one of these in those days, and so it's needs to be very thorough. Now, rationing, of course, applies primarily to new goods. The other side of that coin is going to be recycling programs or other ways of stretching these supplies. So, for example, it was really common to have like household fat collecting stations. Turning in those household waste fats, your bacon grease, things like that from your cooking, could earn you extra ration stamps. And that is because household fats were pretty important. They were commonly recycled into glycerin, which was used in the manufacture of gunpowder, among other things. And well, it is a war after all. There is going to be a significant expenditure of gunpowder. Other recycling initiatives like scrap metal drives were really popular throughout the state. And of course, Victory Gardens, we have a few photos here. The Florida State College for Women, that's now FSU, here in my hometown in Tallahassee, had a defense garden. Another photo here is I couldn't find a photo from Gulf County showing an enormous pile of scrap like this, but we're going to talk in a minute about how much Gulf County collected. This is just some children with at least the photo sites. I don't know if they really weighed it. 24,000 pounds of scrap metal in one 1942 drive. I've seen reference, and I think this photo is taken as part of a statewide Junior Salvage Army initiative. In 1942, these children collected more than 12 million pounds of metal throughout the state. To put it into perspective, that's like a significant portion of like the Eiffel Tower's weight. It's a lot. It's a lot is what it is. So let me shuffle my screen sharing here just one moment because we do want to talk a little bit more specifically about Gulf County. I've got some documents here on Florida memory. So here is, we're looking at a letter from a certain Mr. Fleischel of the St. Joe Lumber and Export Company. And so, he is chairman of the Gulf County General Salvage Committee in those days. This is in late 1942, actually just about this time of year. So this is just, a brief little letter. He's kind of correcting the record, saying that they had sent off to the statewide defense council a number of about 200,000 pounds of scrap for the year. And he's just mentioning, well, we included some 590 tons, which we're still working on. We're going to get that to you soon. And it looks like a lot was already being collected by the St. Joe Paper Company, really just as part of their business. So this is probably not part of that same Junior Salvage Army drive I mentioned, but only because it looks like in Gulf County, this was being done at a professional level. They were already collecting scrap. And so they, for that year, had shipped just about 200,000 pounds, which is, once again, just a ton. Piles of scrap, just like the one we see from Escambia County would have been somewhere in Port St. Joe, I imagine. Now, that Junior Salvage Army drive I mentioned, that is going to pull in the State Department of Education to help organize those. And that was always kind of the pattern of a lot of these scrap drives. There was, with the Junior Scrap Army specifically, I just like this story. When you brought in your scrap, you were also invited to submit the names for a Liberty ship, which would, ostensibly be produced by the scrap metal, or from the scrap metal, I should say, that the students collected. There's another problem built into these scrap metal drives, which is, of course, who comes to get all of that. Another way where the State Defense Council is going to step in and help coordinate between, cities and towns and their county government and the state government. It all needs to work together. Otherwise, you just have big piles of scrap metal in your town and it never goes anywhere, right? There's logistical challenges where we see this statewide organization coming into play. Now, in addition to rationing and recycling and otherwise making do to make sure more resources could go towards a war effort, many Floridians invested money directly in government bonds. Excuse me, I see that picture. This is down, I think, in the Tampa area where they are signing what looks to be a big bomb, not a bond. There was always some kind of celebration at the end of these war bond drives. There were, of course, plenty of options, to purchase from big events like this one, where you could, sign this big naval shell or maybe sitting in the airplane or something like that. Or you could just stick it on a payroll plan and get that automatic deduction. Other people, of course, and perhaps more commonly, as we see on the right, could just go to the post office to purchase bonds there. I don't know. It seems like a little less fun than going to the big street party. I can imagine maybe some music at this event, things like that. They want it to be something which is enjoyable to contribute to, good for morale too. Let's move on a little bit to talk about some of how this is all organized. How's the scrap hauled away? Who is, keeping track of the bonds being sold, and on and on. We're going to talk about the county civil defense councils and especially the block plan. From the perspective of the state government, every one of these initiatives, the rationing, the salvage, the bonds, which were accomplished primarily at the level of individuals, represented a huge organizational challenge. I've already danced around that question a little bit. If shoppers needed ration books, how were they going to get them? How did people find out about the scrap drive? How did people find out about the big war bond event where you could, go downtown and celebrate a little bit? Inevitably, the needs of any given combination of place and activity were going to stretch the limits of their organization in different ways. And to help address this issue, the United States Office of Civilian Defense put forward the block plan, as they called it, which functioned more like a framework for sharing information rather than, a set of instructions. And so we can see a diagram here showing kind of the outlines of how this all works. You have your local defense council is going to get word, from the state level, who's going to get word from the federal level. So we're going DC to Tallahassee to the county defense council, and then there are going to be committees within that council. We saw a little earlier that letter from the chairman of the salvage committee and various different committees. And from there, they're going to get that information out to the blocks or the zones or something. And so this block plan makes up the foundation of the majority of civilian activities that we see on the home front during World War II. It is focused primarily upon civilian services rather than defense activities, but it does follow, it's kind of got a sister organization in the Air Raid Warden service, which is its counterpart on the defense side of civilian defense. We're going to discuss both of these kind of interchangeably today, as their structure is really similar. And so both of these, we're going to start with the block plan. Specifically, they're established to assure total coverage of all households, including all sorts of different things: transportation, recreation, consumer interest, nutrition, welfare, and childcare, on and on and on. And as you can see, this casts a pretty wide net. I want to stress here at the top, not every concept mentioned in that list are necessarily in practice at all times or in all places. Part of the point of this is that it was flexible. And in fact, one of the first orders of business when a county was setting up its defense council, they're going to conduct surveys to get a sense of who in their communities might be willing to volunteer and what skills they want to put to use in doing so. So again, this is a framework for communication, not a program itself. We do see an example of that framework at the local level. So, here's that pipeline. Say for example, we're looking at a case where news needs to go out about a change in price controls. So the local defense council would work out any local level details, and then that information is going to go down to the zone and the section leaders. From there, individual block leaders would knock on doors and tell people. Now, generally, a block in this system, which is nationwide, we see the block system in place nationwide. A block is about a dozen households. Okay, it's not necessarily a city block. The idea, of course, was that local leaders could shape that plan in the way that made sense to them. It also, the idea here is that the block leader is going to be somebody somebody in your community. 12 households is not that many. It's probably going to be somebody who lives on your street. You know what I mean? It's somebody you know. This allows for effective communication in every community dynamic. Now, we're going to switch to another image here on Florida Memory, showing early on. This is right when the Gulf County Defense Council is established. You actually see here it is on Board of County Commissioners letterhead. They didn't have letterhead yet for the Defense Council. So this is to Mr. George Burr, who was the statewide director. And this is a short little letter to inform the statewide Defense Council of who is going to be doing what in Gulf County. So this is just a listing of the names of the division heads together with their occupations. And so I'll encourage you to go find this on Florida Memory a little later if you want a closer look, but we will see, there's a division of power and fuel head up by Jim Bounds of the St. Joe Paper Company. It looks like the division of labor and personnel is run by a certain W.O. Anderson, who was the owner of the St. Joe Motor Company. There's 2 pages to this, so let me look at this other one because we do want to know who the chairman is, of course, or excuse me, who wrote the letter. That was written by Miss Virginia Owens, who volunteered to be, the recording secretary of the Defense Council, which is, an important job, especially from the perspective of archives. It is likely that Miss Owens and, her successors typed up all of the documents we're looking at today, taking those minutes and making sure that that information is knowable here in 2022. So a shout out to Miss Owens. A lot of different divisions here: communications and information, education and morale. Everybody is stepping up in the ways they feel comfortable with. There is the block plan. As I say, it's not written in stone. The idea is that it is going to be a very flexible program for figuring all of this, logistical challenge out and making things flexible, and you can get information down the chain very quickly from the Capitol building to somebody's doorstep. This plan represents a very similar initiative to that air raid warden service I mentioned, but they are completely separate. In fact, it's worth mentioning from the beginning, the United States Office of Civil Defense emphasized, and I quote, "In communities where the air raid warden service is well organized, the block organization for civilian services should follow the same area pattern and use the same district designations to avoid confusion and improve coordination." End quote. The idea is that they're going to be similar, but they're still separate organizations because the mission of the air raid warden service is a lot more specific and the stakes are higher. This is we're talking about blackout drills and what is the system that's going to be in place if there is an attack upon the United States. And so it's really easy to imagine, of course, that federal and state leadership didn't, they wanted to leverage that system for coordination, but they didn't want to dilute the authority of their air raid wardens. So just like every 12 households would have a block leader, they would also have an air raid warden. They may or may not have been the same person. Again, it's not like it couldn't be the same person, but you needed that clear line when, hey, I'm visiting today in my capacity as block leader versus I'm visiting today to tell you there's a blackout that you're going to need to comply with. One's got a little more authority behind it. And so we have these 2 parallel frameworks for translating defense and civilian activities from the federal level on down through the state government into specific localities. Let's talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice. So I want to share a few examples today from the State Archives collections. The following events are detailed in County Defense Council reports to the State Defense Council. We are going to start with, this one is from Gulf County. I am not certain if this drill actually took place, funny enough, but there's this application and an outline submitted and approved by the State Defense Council. We have another letter saying, "Dear State Defense Council, here's our plan. May we do this?" They got the go ahead. So here is, Gulf County's test blackout drill, going to be in 1942, and there are more pages here than I can go through with us today, but we see, first of all, kind of our cast of characters, the personnel who are going to be involved. We've got auxiliary police and firemen, messengers, everybody on down, who's providing the ambulance. St. Joe Motor Company, I imagine, probably had some vehicles suitable for, what shall we say, you can rig it up like an ambulance, right? And this is the idea of this drill, is that there is an event that's happened that is going to be beyond the, everyday capacity of the county to respond to. And we even actually can see some people are actually planned out down to the minute. So at 8:40 that night, the senior warden of the business district is going to report an incident, a bomb explosion, God forbid. And then we've actually got people volunteering to be casualties, right? And, this is not only an exercise for, the people in the command center, which is where that report is going, but there is theoretically going to be, people at that site playing victims, and everybody from top to bottom, from the chair to the defense counsel to the ambulance driver, is going to have to practice. Very interesting document, if I do say so. So do check this out a little later on if you'd like on Florida Memory. There's, like 20 pages, 27 pages of this. The title is, go figure, Application for an Outline Plan for a Test Blackout Drill by the Gulf County Defense Council, 1942. That's the title that I made. I think it's a pretty good description of what we're looking at in this document. There are some other examples that we've got from other parts of Florida that I think are neat, and I do want to share. A lot of this is happening in 1942. So in January of 1942, this is a few months before the block plan is rolled out. That air raid warden service is already active. So, again, we see that one comes first. That one's a little more important. There's a series of blackout drills around the state that provided a chance to see what worked and what did not. So we just saw Gulf County's application. What we don't know is, and what I didn't see in their files, was kind of an after action report from that drill. So we've got a few after action reports from other counties and cities that can shed a little light on the kind of issues that were revealed by these drills. In general, people are going to be notified of the drill. Signals are going to be arranged to mark the beginning. And at that point, the big part of this for, the people who are not participating in the drill, in terms of, actually as part of the defense apparatus, but, just folks at home, their role to play in this was to black out, turn the lights off. The idea being, of course, to deprive any enemy aircraft the benefit of lights and landmarks to navigate by. So in Arcadia, they scheduled actually a Civil Air Patrol airplane to fly over Arcadia during that drill. Local wardens set up multiple stations on the ground to investigate that plane's reports. So, they're testing this in the most direct way possible. They have somebody in an airplane seeing if there's lights on. They even arranged in Arcadia for Boy Scouts to be assembled at City Hall, I quote, with their wheels to relay messages on the ground that night. I can only assume this means the Boy Scouts were on bicycles. Otherwise, I would question the wisdom of turning the Boy Scouts loose in cars with no headlights. Must have been bikes. Another drill in Lakeland a few days later, we see in their written report after that drill is complete, they're reporting nearly 100% compliance. This is how thorough they were being. They were going to investigate, reports of individual lights left on. The most significant light in the city at that time, the wardens discovered in Lakeland a school basketball game, which was reluctantly dispersed. Again, I think you find a bunch of high schoolers playing basketball, they're just going to say, oh no, of course we didn't hear the siren. It's Friday night. We're just playing basketball here. Didn't hear it at all, did we? This is the kind of thing they're going to find. Other reports prove to be, maybe a fireplace which was left lit. This report does posit that the signal siren they don't think was quite loud enough. Whether or not the basketball game actually heard it remains to be seen. So right, this is the level of thoroughness we're talking about. This is fireplaces and things like that. This is very detailed work. Concerning the non-defense side of things, so we're going to jump back over to the block plan side of this. There are other records to speak of a similar attention to detail. I mentioned that Junior Scrap Army drive a little earlier. Subsequent to that drive, local defense councils were able to step in and coordinate the actual removal of that scrap. There are some records I've seen where the state road department, they're coordinating with the state road department to, use their work trucks, which are more than likely already pretty well distributed around the state. And so you have a state road crew coming to haul off this scrap. Even that, we're roping in a completely separate department of the government at this point. All told, according to the State Defense Council of Florida's 1941 and 1942 biennial report, there were at least by 1942. 137 county and local defense councils in Florida. That is going to be one for every county, one for every metropolitan area, and one for every municipality of 2,500 and over. And of course, that's 1942. This is still pretty early in the war. Even so, the civilian services portion had grown really quickly. And that same report notes that, I mentioned earlier, there were surveys sent out of volunteers, people who were volunteering and listing their skills. That survey had been responded to by 750,000 Floridians statewide. And each of those people, of course, listing their experience, training, and preferences for how they would like to serve. One of the really interesting things about this system, and you see it more on the block plan side, the civilian side of things. This is not just to get information down the chain, it helps information move from one household on up as well. And in some instances, this allows for and kind of enables grassroots style organization for volunteer activity. So of course, we've seen in Gulf County a lot of local folks stepping up or kind of modifying things that they were already doing to help the scrap drive, to help various initiatives. One story I really just love, there's an example out of Miami, and this is later on in 1944, on February 11th, we have this telegram. There is a certain Mrs. Heyman of Miami who sends word, probably by way of her block leader, up to the Dade County Defense Council that she was having a gathering at her house. Now, in Miami in those days, there were a lot of service members kind of quartered in the nice hotels near the beach before they shipped out to various parts. And so Miss Heyman sends word to the State Defense Council. From there, the news got over to the Servicemen's Pier, and half dozen soldiers came over for dinner. The Dade County Defense Council reports by way of Mrs. Heyman that the rugs were rolled up and the Victrola was played. So, this is like, hey, we're having a dinner party. Can you send who's hungry, So in this case, with the help of the local defense council, this is, a single household connecting with the U.S. Army in the space of a day or two, which just goes to show, again, the flexibility. This is a two-way street. There is no act of volunteerism too small. And this is just one household that's willing to share dinner in an evening. And I just think that's really neat. In practice, this is also a little hint that in practice, the system's somewhat less formal than State Defense Council letterhead might imply, right? This is the same basic framework, used for everything, right? The blackout drills, the scrap drives, the dinner parties, it is all kind of revolving around this air raid warden / block plan system. And again, that is a chain reaching from Miss Heyman's house in Miami to Washington, D.C., right? That's really neat. There are, of course, some more involved modes of volunteer service. Those systems we talked about are ultimately, other than the people who were serving on the defense councils, a little more passive, but there were certainly more intensive things that you could do. Of course, there are things like the women's auxiliaries, the WAC and waves. Those are actually closer to uniformed service than volunteerism. That could be a whole nother talk. So we're going to mention them, but then we're going to talk about a little less regular volunteer activities. Things that you could do. Still at the community level, but not necessarily stepping into uniform. You will recall that blackout drill in Arcadia I mentioned, where they had arranged for a Civil Air Patrol plane to actually spot lights. That plane was almost certainly flown by a civilian volunteer. And of course, they had to be a pilot to do that. So that is something that is, not really something you could just pick up on the spur of the moment. You gotta do a little work to be a pilot, and you also have to, if not own a plane, be qualified on. I think some Civil Air Patrols may have had an aircraft or two as an organization. Other times you might have used your own aircraft. So that's a volunteer flying a plane and coordinating with the wardens and the Boy Scouts there on the ground. Other people, like the men pictured here, were part of the motorcycle auxiliary. They volunteer their time and their motorbikes to serve as messengers or escort shipments around the state. This is a photograph of an African-American motorcycle auxiliary. I do not know where the photo was taken, but you can see they must live near the water. I see some pine trees and a big sand dune there. there's no telling where they would have been sent, week to week and month to month as part of this volunteer service. But that's how they could step up. Their volunteer forum, they probably said, well, I've got a motorcycle. I'm willing to ride it wherever you need me to go. These surveys were doubtless really helpful. Civilians with access to a boat could apply to a Coast Guard auxiliary through their local defense council. This auxiliary is intended to help establish more regular coastal patrols while freeing up the active Coast Guard vessels for other duties. Now, I don't believe one of these auxiliaries was actually based out of Gulf County, but they would cruise for days at a time. This is, yes, you're a volunteer with your own boat, but you would probably be sailing out of sight of land and overnight. So this is pretty involved in my mind. Here is some correspondence between George Snowden, who was the chairman of the Gulf County Defense Council, and General Albert Blanding at the state level, saying, he's talking a little bit about his concerns for possible enemy action in the Gulf County area. And especially here on page 2, he does mention that it is our intention to continue having the dim out until we are advised by the Coast Guard that there are definitely no further enemy actions in the Gulf. There were submarines, there were German submarines in the Gulf of Mexico at that time. So that is what certainly the concern in Gulf County would have been. There was an oil pipeline there, and of course the paper mill and things like that. And that, of course, is the concern primarily of this Coast Guard auxiliary. So I don't know if they were based out of Gulf County, but they were probably stopping there, these auxiliary vessels. As those patrols could last a few days, there were some slightly stricter requirements for this volunteer service and others. There is a letter to the director of Florida's State Defense Council from an official in the Coast Guard justifying, it sounds like maybe the question was asked, well, why are you turning away these volunteers? You're making them take a test. And this Coast Guard official basically describes their test as, he says, quote, any yachtsman or boatman whose boat cannot pass inspection and he cannot pass this examination has no business in a boat, end quote. I'm sure they were grateful for volunteers, but a volunteer naval patrol was no good if they would in turn need to be rescued by another Coast Guard vessel. That's just going to take 2 ships off of other jobs. So there were some requirements for that one. That's pretty involved when you sign up to, go sail the Gulf of Mexico for a couple of days to hunt submarines. That's starting to get into maybe even some dangerous territory for volunteerism. So that's an interesting little Coast Guard auxiliary thing that formed. Writ large, the civil defense apparatus supported a really wide variety of volunteer initiatives, which extended into general disaster preparedness. And again, this organization, this block plan is really well suited for that. What is a natural disaster but a large-scale event requiring local recovery? It's gonna require cooperation from every level of the government. And so while the focus of these programs, especially in the World War II days, is very much on responding to acts of war and the acts of an enemy, civil defense in the United States in these years also grew to encompass firefighters and search and rescue and utility repair crews. These are the activities that we would associate as being more in line with disaster response today. This is where we start seeing some things growing into later programs. There's one I want to remark upon, especially in the Panhandle. A lot of county directors were expressing interest in cooperating with the U.S. Forest Service. And in the South, in general, the regional civil defense director, so this is an office in Atlanta, federal level, encourages all state directors to explore cooperating with that U.S. Forest Service. And here we see a little bit of the point I've been making. In that letter, he says it is impossible to make specific recommendations, but I believe that it behooves us to make every effort to cooperate with the Forest Service in the control of forest fires. That is to say, probably in Atlanta, there are fewer people concerned about a forest fire in downtown Atlanta, whereas here in Leon County and in Gulf County, we do have a very large stretch of forest between our cities, don't we? I can imagine a forest fire being an issue there, right? And so locally, where forest fires are concerned, the door is open, the light is green, figure out some forest fighters if that's what you need to do, if that's what you have people interested in doing. Absolutely, it's appropriate. Further outside of the civil defense system, there are other initiatives like the U.S. Crop Corps we see over here on the right that's going to aim to connect volunteers with farms who needed workers at those times. One element of that program was an effort between the Department of Agriculture federally and the Florida State Education Department to encourage high school students to take up farm work. I think the idea is that there's an option after school. They'll cart you out to a farm, work till sundown, head on home. I think there are also options maybe in the summertime. The Department of Agriculture would just find you a farm to live on. That's pretty, intensive service too. And then here in the middle, we actually see just a poster with the different insignias developed by the Office of Civil Defense for the various services. So everything is the circle and triangle logo. And then we see the Civil Air Patrol, as we say. We see air raid wardens here with kind of the stripes. There are fire watchers. There are demolition and clearance crews. The idea being, again, God forbid, if that bomb Gulf County simulated had been real, there may have been cleanup to do. There are even chaplains. There's an evacuation service too. So all of the different things civil defense was doing. Now, of course, just as everybody is pulling together for this war effort, when victory comes, everybody celebrates together too, uniformed or not. They had worked for it. We see just a few scenes of celebrations in Florida. Here is a parade, including some of those women's auxiliaries I mentioned earlier. That's actually Monroe Street, just around the corner from me. On the right is a scene from Miami, where there was a great big party. The note on the back of that picture, if I'm not mistaken, this light pole here, they specified they had to grease that ahead of time because people were just going to climb it. And there's photos later of what looks to be somebody climbing that thing anyways. So do poke around Florida memory. Maybe you can find that particular feat of acrobatics. Now, of course, victory means that in the short term, the need for civil defense programs receded. These programs don't go away, though. They take on a really different kind of urgency during the Cold War. And, this is when we start seeing nuclear defense growing in very significant prominence to overshadow a lot of the other ways these organizations can work, a lot of the ways we've been talking about. And in fact, in Florida, the State Defense Council has a change of name. It becomes the Office of Civil Defense, kind of gets a little more formalized, but its role as that bridge between federal programs and local action remains the same. And then, of course, later, as the Cold War cools off even further and there's less of a threat of a nuclear war, civil defense and general disaster preparedness rolls into FEMA, right? The FEMA today serves a very similar purpose as these predecessor agencies. In some ways, we see the roots of all these offices and departments. The roots are in World War II. This marks the beginning of these kinds of programs and the multi-level government cooperation that these programs require proves to be useful in a lot of other contexts, especially disaster recovery. We've had our share of hurricanes here along the Gulf Coast. I grew up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and I'll just remember, as long as I live, after Hurricane Katrina, at one point, FEMA brought in a big, truck, it was a trailer rigged up with washing machines. And that is not, what I would have thought about as being disaster recovery, but, somebody said oh yeah, these people could really use some clean clothes. And, FEMA helps orchestrate somebody pulling in a custom, washing machine tractor trailer to the middle school. And all of a sudden, that's a community that can have clean laundry again. It's the big efforts and the small details that come together in a lot of these disaster preparedness programs. So as we close out, World War II changes Florida in a lot of ways, and the state government is no exception. Through the development of this civil defense program, we see the roots of programs that still exist in some form. Florida still has emergency management operations and things like that. It is a really interesting program to delve into because it does touch every county, and it still touches every county. This is a pattern that's still in place, if you will. So before I open up for questions, I will mention, first of all, some contact information. Again, if you don't have questions right now, something comes to you later, do send us an email. The email addresses you see right here on the screen are info@dos.myflorida is going to get you to the state library. Our librarians are specialized in published materials, and there is plenty written on World War II. Archives@dos.myflorida.com will get you, go figure, to the archives reference desk. They are specialists like me who are going to work in archival collections. Of course, here is me too. Feel free to email me if you want to. That phone number does ring my desk. I will let you know. My job has me browsing the stacks pretty often, the shelves. So I'll encourage you to leave a message if I'm not there. And then, we do need to mention some of our funding details. Florida Memory is a grant program. Everything we discussed today comes from records in the state archives collections, which once again are open to you and any person. You can find everything in the slides here that I talked about on floridamemory.com. For everything else, for that other 99%, our reading room is open to the public Monday to Friday from 9 to 4:30, and you can email our reference staff too. So with that all being said, I want to open the floor for questions now.
We have a couple. Would there be a place to find out how many from like the Gulf County or a specific county went into active military?
Yes, there are a few places to do that. Number one being, this is probably going to be actually in a published document. So it may be available through a library more so than an archives, Department of War statistical document. For example, I know of one resource we have from World War I, actually, which is, kind of a service index card for every service member from Florida. That it serves as kind of the very, very compressed service record. Now, we don't have something similar for World War II. That's because the organization kind of changes of how our military records generated and kept, and it's not really a state military department anymore. It's going to be the National Military Department. There are some database services that may be helpful, like Fold3. That is actually, if you're familiar with Ancestry.com, it is run by the same company. Fold3 is specific to military records. We have access to that here if you come and visit the state library. Sarah, I hope I'm not making promises, but y'all might have access to it as well. At your local library, a Fold3 database could have that kind of listing and could certainly get you access to the individual service records as well. Those are going to be federal documents primarily by World War II. I don't know of any set of records in the state archives collections that's going to answer that question exactly. But there are maybe some things we could put together to get at that information, or at least to get the outlines of that information. So if that's something you're looking to do, that's exactly the kind of question we would love to work with you on.
And we don't have the database yet. We have Ancestry, but not that one just yet. I think it's a separate, correct? You still have to purchase both.
I believe so, yeah.
I believe so. I have seen it at other libraries, so maybe we can look into it. And another question was, do you know how close the German submarines got to the Florida coastline, including like that Gulf County area?
There are, that I have seen, very few confirmed sightings. A lot of times these submarines are they're kind of scouting. That letter from the Gulf County Council reference, there's a dim out being done, which is not a full blackout. They're just turning off lights along the coast so that, if you're a German submarine commander and you're out there in the Gulf and you stick your periscope up out of the water, that's really all that has to come out. You won't be able to see a lot. There's not going to be stuff in front of those lights for you to make out. There are some reports, of ships burning, especially off of, Jacksonville, more in the Atlantic coast. U-boats did make their way into the Gulf, but in terms of how close, that is unfortunately something that it's just not known. And well, I mean, wouldn't you know it, there's a lot of effort being put into searching for these things, and that is because they are hard to find. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but they were there. There are reports, of ships being sunk and things like that. I would imagine not too far off the coast. They were there for scouting. They were in visual range of the coast, is what we do know.
it's always surprising. Like I was even surprised how close subs got in general. There's a lovely book called I believe it's The Shadow Divers by Kirsten, and that's off the coast of New Jersey. There was a sunken U-boat, and it's a fascinating story. But it's interesting how close it got to just the Panhandle.
Closer than we would like. Let's say that.
And last question, I believe, unless we have any questions from James or Joyelle. But another question is, we entered World War II a little bit later, post Pearl Harbor. So was there anything documenting how Florida was kind of preparing for the possibility of war?
Yes, and in fact, some of these early Defense Council documents do predate Pearl Harbor. It was very much on people's minds, and there are already, I think, a few ration programs and things like that in place, because of course the United States was not sending soldiers to the war, but they were sending a lot of material with the Lend-Lease programs, especially to Great Britain and other European nations. And so there was already a lot of thought about this. There was already some involvement. For the most part, we do not see the full organization of the county level until Pearl Harbor. That is, very much that's the wake up call. That is when all of a sudden we do need to be concerned about an enemy attack on American soil, and we do need to be concerned about bombings and submarines and things like that. And so the Air Raid Warden Service has been kind of plotted out and planned out, and we see it reach fully down to the local level more in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And so the answer to that is yes and no. Certainly nobody was pretending it was not an issue, but in terms of when are you going to get that full buy-in, that's we're going to see after Pearl Harbor.
And we do have another question from James. It's more about search and rescue for dead bodies after, like, during the World War II era. Told that maybe Jackson River might have had, and then German subs may have gone in to hide. I don't know if you could delve further into that or not. I know that, and it wouldn't be specific to this, but I do know there is organizations working on recovering bodies from World War II, and Man in the Sea Museum down here is affiliated somehow with that search and rescue effort, but I can't remember the details.
We're getting a little into
more specifics.
I'm afraid my expertise on submarine operations are pretty thin, but I do know that eventually a sub is going to have to surface and spend some time on the surface, not only to in those days recharge batteries and things like that, get some fresh air. Also, I cannot imagine the inside of a submarine is an overly comfortable place to be when it is sealed up. For the sake of the crew, they would have had to surface probably somewhere. Oh, James, I see you have a little more here. So they would go into Apalachicola to get fruits and vegetables. Now that I don't know. I don't know about, would they have made supply runs and things like that? I suppose it is plausible if any crew members had good English. You know what? I can't imagine that as a shop owner in Apalachicola, I would have been particularly on the lookout for German sailors in my store. It's not really something that you would think about. Regarding the German sub commander who came to the U.S. after the war, I would encourage you, James, on that one to email me. That's going to be a question that we may need to do a little more research into. So in general, yes, it is certainly plausible that a sub would have surfaced near the shore, found some calm water, spent some time recharging both equipment and crew.
World War II, World War I, 15% of Americans were German descent. Not sure about World War II. In addition, there is a sunk lumber ship that the crew themselves sank as it was leaving Port St. Joe Bay in order to waiting for that and avoid hazardous trip to Tampa.
I see. So kind of intentionally blocking off that bay. I'm certain that could have been done. Yeah. that's a story that we would have to research some more into. I bet we can find some newspaper accounts of that and find you the details on that. So the wreck is still there. The crew survived. Oh, so you're saying they didn't want to sail to Tampa because they knew subs were out there. That makes sense too. That's understandable. Yeah, there may be some more story to be had there, and we're gonna have to discover it together, James. So you got two good questions for me. I would really encourage you to email me and we can
Oh, it sounds
see
fun
about that.
to learn more about. Okay, very cool. The local dive shops do a little diving there. It's amazing what the divers can do. They know all the spots.
Oh, that's right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Matthew. And it was such a lovely talk. I didn't even think about how FEMA would be connected with this as kind of being the starter for how FEMA works. And
Kind of a
yeah,
cousin, you could
yeah,
say. Yeah.
very fascinating.
Yes. Well, thank you everybody for having me. It's been such a pleasure, and I hope you all enjoyed this little talk. I hope you're not tired of me yet, and I'll hope to hear from you soon.